Warning, the shadow map that blinded the Luftwaffe. The sirens were late. 10 miles out, a ribbon of orange already crawled across the marsh. Bomb doors opened. Sticks fell in steady rhythm, thudding into a city that didn't exist. Then silence. No screams, no engines, just wind over wet ground and the ticking of hot shrapnel in mud. They'd bombed a map that wasn't there. To understand how a phantom Skyline swallowed real bombs, we need to rewind into a winter Britain on edge. If the Blitz landed clean, on docks, plants, power, London would bleed out. Unless fire could lie. Unless someone could teach light to speak a false language. The night London should have died. The fear wasn't abstract. If raiders hit deep and true, factories would stall, food convoys would choke, and the leadership would look out over a capital that couldn't breathe. In September 1940, the Luftwaffe pivoted hard from airfields to cities. Firestorms followed. Streets that had rehearsed blackout drills for a year found out how much heat a single incendiary could yank out of a roof beam. It wasn't the blast alone. It was the burn, the way one ember became a lane, then a block, then a wind-fed river of flame. Anti-aircraft crews fired so much they sweated inside greatcoats. Searchlights combed the sky and just made the haze glow like dirty milk. Communications lines tangled. Fire brigades guessed at coordinates through smoke. Bomber streams carved bomb lines across maps pinned in cellar headquarters, and the chalk dust tasted like fear. People slept under tables in tube stations and went to work the next morning. But here, that's where it bent strange. Damage officers began to spot crater clusters in places that didn't quite make sense. Empty fields pocked like chessboards, marshland torn, hedgerows shredded, while the blocks the crews aimed for took fewer hits than the math predicted. On the worst nights, you still got charred brick and broken glass. But then there were outliers, payloads dropping heavy across nothing, as if a hand had nudged the stream off to the side. The RAF and Home Security logged everything. Anomalies went onto a quiet board, a secret damage map layered with pencil circles that never made the newspapers. Was it Pathfinder drift, wind shear, crew error at altitude? Maybe, but the pattern didn't feel random. The misses showed spacing. The spacing suggested aim, and the aim hinted at attraction. Bombers were seeing something, or thought they were, and responding the way trained crews do when a target signature snaps into place. Meanwhile, on the ground, blackout discipline created a paradox. The darker the city got, the more any leak mattered. A single unshielded bulb across a canal bridge could act like a lure. Fire brigades learned to fear their own successes. Put out a blaze too quickly, and you might erase the only honest landmark in a sea of black. Put it out too late, and you'd lose the road, the block, the ward. That tension sat on every hose reel and lamp hood. What nobody outside a handful of rooms knew at the time was that a small circle of engineers had started to treat fire itself like a signal. They asked a blunt question. If bombers navigate by light, heat, and contrast when the coast disappears, what would happen if you gave them a better story somewhere else? Not a flare, not a bonfire, a grammar, streets and blocks of convincing glow and ember, a skyline that read true from 10 miles out on an instrument and through a bomb aimer's hood. Evidence on the secret map teased that it might already be working in pockets. On some nights near Bristol and Portsmouth, clusters fell where no population lived. Crews in shelters heard the rumble shift and fade to the west, to the river's edge, away from cranes and main lines. Fire officers swapped quiet looks over tea and didn't say what they suspected. You didn't speak a miracle. You counted it twice and waited for the third. But the Luftwaffe wasn't guessing. They began to bring beams and timing into their runs, Nickerbeam first, then X-Gerat and Y-Gerat, to carry crews over the coast and into a box where the bomb toggle could fall almost on schedule. That made the odd crater fields even stranger. If instruments were guiding men to the city, what lifted their eyes and convinced their hands to release somewhere else? The answer, if it existed, had to be precise, repeatable, and brave. Lighting fake streets under a live raid isn't an experiment you get to run twice. Inside town halls and buried control rooms, the stakes stayed personal. Shopkeepers rolled metal shutters over displays and ran buckets to rooftops. Hospital porters crossed courtyards during lulls with night sight ruined by a single errant match. Telephone girls listened for a tone change in a caller's breath that meant the roof was gone. If the raids landed clean, those lives would align into an unbroken line of loss. Break the line by a few miles, and you'd keep a ward open, a crane standing, a rail yard loading coal by morning. AA Command did what it could, but even 4 guns per battery, throwing shells into the dark at a stately cadence, couldn't stop every run. The job that remained wasn't to shoot down the night, it was to bend it. And somewhere, out by a farm track that didn't look like anything from the air, men and women stood by drums and trays, waiting for a signal. They wore soaked sacking over their clothes and smelled of paraffin. They held ignition cords and counted wind gusts, because if the wind shifted, one cue would betray the trek. This was the moment everything changed. Crater clusters weren't mistakes. They were decisions coaxed out of crews who thought they were finishing the job. On the secret damage map, pencil circles began to stack in patterns that matched a plan only a few people had seen. The question now wasn't whether misaim could be farmed. It was who had the nerve and the mathematics to farm it across a nation. To understand why the misses started to look like mercy, we need to meet the engineer who decided fire could lie on command. The fire engineer, Colonel Turner's problem set. Meet Colonel John Turner, a civil engineer with the temperament of a surveyor and the nerve of a sapper. He'd retired from the Royal Engineers, then got dragged back by the Air Ministry works with a mandate that sounded like a dare. Save cities without asking for more fighters, more guns, or more light in a blackout that already felt absolute. He didn't bring romance to it. He brought notebooks filled with all-fire behavior, factory hazard audits, and the cold math of how heat flows when you don't want it to. Here's the pivot that changed the winter. Turner treated German bomb aim as a human-machine conversation. Crews came in high and tired, reading a blend of instruments, training, and whatever glow slipped through the blackout. Under stress, brains grab patterns. So give them a pattern, not a bonfire that reads wrong. A city has rhythm, like pools and gutters, flickers and steadies. Turner called it a grammar, streets and blocks speaking in flame and ember to a bomb aimer who only needed a nudge. To build that nudge, he went somewhere odd for a war project, Shepperton Film Studios. Set designers knew how to sell a lie at scale with nothing but angles and light. They could fake depth with staggered highlights, craft skylines with shadow seams, and time a power cut, cue that felt real because it was slightly imperfect. At Shepperton, Turner's team started sketching the city in embers alphabet. Sodium yellow glows for tram lines, dusky pools for warehouse yards, pinpoint leaks to mimic windows smashed by heat. They broke the Decoy world into 3 families. QF, special fire, was heat and flame you could control with trays, pans, and shallow pits fed by oil, water, and coke. It gave you ember fields and the hungry orange that tells a crew they've done damage. QL, special lighting, was light without fire. Masked bulbs, sodium sim lamps, glow boxes behind baffles, vehicle lights on rails you could start and kill on cue. And SF, Starfish, was the big canvas. City-scale arrays where QF and QL layered into something a navigator would swear was a dockland or a tram grid seen through haze. But none of it mattered if it didn't fit the geometry of a German run. Turner mapped distance from coast legs, habitual route bends, fuel ceilings that forced altitude choices, and the drift you get when wind and radio beams argue. He'd seen oil fires trick men's eyes before. He knew how a seam of brightness pulled hands toward a switch. The trick was timing. If you lit too early, pathfinders might spot the lie. Too late, bombs were already walking down High Street. You needed a window, and that window moved with cloud, wind, and the clockwork of enemy radio beams. Meanwhile, quietly, a separate fight rumbled in the ether. The RAF countered the German guidance under the codename Headache, and their answer, Aspirin, slipped deceptive tones into Nickerbean's lobes to make centered feel subtly off. Meacon stations, masking beacons, rebroadcast German navigational signals from British soil, bending bearings just enough to seed doubt. Turner didn't control those transmitters, but he could align his fall cities with where a bent bearing would coax a bomber stream. When dials whispered left, his ember streets needed to sit where left would feel right. Here, S-where procedure became a weapon. Turner pushed for ignition authority to sit with regional controllers who could see raids develop, not with London clerks. He wanted compartment maps split across ministries, so nobody outside the Corps could assemble the whole parallel Britain. Site crews appeared on perils as farm hands and drainage labor. Codes changed fast. Locations got alias names. Even within his own circle, people saw plans through keyholes. On the ground, the kit looked blunt. Star-shaped fire trays you could flood or feed, shallow pans that took a spark and held it, cable runs buried to tiny control bunkers with a field telephone and a man watching wind vanes. But the choreography was exact. Staggered ignitions to mimic fire racing along roofs, dark lanes to sell streets, flares of white to hint at a transformer or a warehouse door burning. A rail glow line beyond the brightest pool, because crews trained to put second sticks where they'd already hurt something. Risk sat in every queue. Set one wrong and you'd teach the Luftwaffe to spot your lie. Use fuel too freely and you'd starve the next night's defense. Miss the wind call and smoke would smother the grammar into a smear the pathfinders would pass over. Turner drilled crews on shutoffs as hard as starts. If the run veered, drown the field. If the timing slipped, wait for the next wave. Discipline saved fuel and the fiction. In quiet moments at Shepperton, Turner and the set men argued about color temperature and shadow length like artists. Then they'd pin those arguments to the most brutal ledger a city keeps, where the bombs fell last time and where they must not fall again. Build a lie a mile wide, then move it 50 yards, then shave 10 seconds off the glow cycle. If the Luftwaffe trusted what their eyes and ears told them, the city would drink the bombs for the docks that couldn't afford another night like the last. The committee that didn't exist. Turner's idea needed a machine that could move money, men, fuel, and lies without leaving fingerprints. It started under home security as a cell so small it could meet in a corridor and not be noticed. No letterhead, no switchboard. If you asked who ran it, you got a shrug and a different name every week. The premise was simple. The more visible an organization is in a blackout, the more it glows on an enemy map. So they built something you couldn't see even if you worked inside it. Procedure carried the weight. Maps were chopped into compartments. Northing and easting grids split and filed in different ministries, so no single clerk could stack a whole decoy on the same desk. Site coordinates lived under alias names that sounded like drainage ditches and hedgerow cuts. Codes were single-use. If a controller burned one phrase to light a basin near a port, that phrase died by morning. Railway schedules that moved oil drums got buried inside agricultural freight tallies. Fuel requisitions looked like irrigation projects. When pay packets went out to the people who set the fires, they were listed as farm hands and canal maintenance. They drew a taxonomy like a civil service might, but it hid a second country. QF special fire sat on one set of ledgers, QL special lighting on another. SF Starfish belonged to neither and both, the large-scale arrays where those families met to sell a 12-mile lie. On paper, it looked like maintenance of rural works in scattered parishes. In reality, it was a parallel Britain designed to be read from 10,000 feet through a bomb site. Control was the tightest piece. Ignition authority couldn't live in Whitehall because London couldn't smell the wind over the Mendips or hear the uneven rumble that meant a stream had split. Regional controllers got that call. In low concrete bunkers with field telephones, they watched wind vanes and listened to filter rooms feed them raid tracks. A raid would cross the coast. A Pathfinder flare would land. Then a decision. Light the first lane, hold the second, kill the third. If anyone broke sequence, the grammar fell apart. If anyone guessed, you taught the Luftwaffe what not to hit next time. Money stayed quiet by design. Civilian ledgers masked the pulse. Cables went in as temporary lines for field drainage. Switchgear looked like pump stations. The crews who hauled coke and oil split their nights between honest farm work and the thing they couldn't mention in town. A site might be managed by a foreman who, by day, fixed fences. By night, he ran a countdown. 30 seconds after the first marker, bring up tray 3, wait for the second stick, open the pit near the rail yard. Inside the cell, even language was shaped to leave no echo. You didn't say Docklands. You said Area B. You didn't say Ignite. You said Open. Messages were clipped, stripped of nouns that might glow if intercepted. A young woman in a basement might spend 8 hours relaying grid letters and wind calls without knowing she just lit a phantom harbor that would drink a squadron's bombs. Meanwhile, at Shepperton, the studio veterans wrote cue sheets like stage managers, but the signatures were fed into the committee as anonymous patterns. A baffled design traveled as a diagram with no origin stamp. A timing tweak appeared as a column in a table, not an argument won over a lamp on a drawing board. If a Starfish worked, credit evaporated into the system. If it failed, the fix arrived as a new pattern and a reminder: never repeat an error within sight of an enemy camera. Security wasn't just to keep German eyes out, it also protected the logic. If you ran a decoy, you knew your switches, your wind, your fuel curve, and not much else. If you controlled a county, you knew your sights and didn't know your neighbor. London held a master ledger in pieces locked in red tag envelopes. The theory was brutal and clean. Break any one link and you couldn't reconstruct the chain. Here, where the metadata turned lethal. The committee didn't only stage light, it staged expectation. It synced QF-QL SFQs to what the ether war would suggest. RAF, Aspirin, transmitters nudged Nickerbean's guidance so a crew heard, centered, while actually drifting. Meacon beacons, masking stations, picked up German navigational signals and rebroadcast them from new points, shifting bearings by degrees that felt like truth. The cell aligned Decoy sighting with those engineered errors. When a bomber's dial whispered a left correction, the full city sat where left would look and sound right. Meanwhile, anti-aircraft tracers and staged power cuts, stitched in the human detail crews, were trained to trust. Every piece had a failsafe, wind above a threshold, and the regional controller could black out the lie in a breath. A sudden pathfinder correction, and a site stood down to avoid teaching. Fuel rationing tightened, and QL took point while QF saved heat for the next moonless window. The doctrine evolved night by night, each raid folded into a private ledger of what sold and what rang false. Out in the fields, the people on those ledgers kept their heads down, took their pay as drainage, and went home with hair that smelled of smoke they couldn't admit they lit. When the first big decoy nights held, when crater circles landed in marsh and scrub and steelworks roared on the next morning, the committee didn't claim a victory. It issued a new code list and moved on. The point wasn't applause. The point was to keep the map the Luftwaffe trusted a step wrong all winter long. Anatomy of a false city. From the road, a Starfish site looked like farm scrub stitched with low mounds. From 10 miles out, it was a city burning. The difference lived under the grass. Cables snaked to a squat concrete box half buried on a slope. A controller with a field phone, a wind vane, and a set of toggles labeled in a code that never said what anything really was. Out in the dark, men in soaked sacking stood by star-shaped trays, their arms like shallow steel petals, each plumbed to feed or drown flame with a twist. Oil, water, and coke waited in measured stacks, because fuel wasn't a bonfire, it was punctuation. The light grammar that Turner's team brought back from Shepperton started with ember. Cities don't blaze evenly, they pulse. So crews laid trays in staggered rows that could step fire across a block, leaving narrow black seams to read as streets. First Q, a low, dirty orange close to the ground, the color you get when beams catch roof tar and soaked joists. Then a brighter lick, a white-orange pop to hint at a warehouse door giving. No symmetry, nothing perfect. Set designers drilled that into cue sheets. Kill perfection, because the eye knows a trick that loops too clean. Sound mattered. Timed bangs traveled on the wind, small detonators and fuel pops seeded to mimic secondary explosions, and the hollow thud of a gas main failing 2 blocks over. A scattered burst of clanks and crackles from tin, scrap in pans, sold the messy bite of a block in pain. In the control box, a chart listed delays. After initial ignition, bring yard 2 pops at 60 seconds, then let them roll off. If a real AA troop nearby chattered into the sky, the controller might cue a light flutter along a rail line to make crews believe they'd hit rolling stock. It wasn't theater for its own sake. It was a nudge to trained expectation. Navigation trickery lived in thin lines. A rail glow ran as a faint, unwavering smear that paralleled a brighter basin. Crews trained to walk sticks along rails after an initial hit would feel that tug. Near docks, pans set with water films reflected flame in a ripple that read as a key under haze. Set men from Shepperton argued for the angle of those reflections, the way a ripple should break, the fraction of dullness a sodium lamp would push through fog. QL, the quiet lighting kit, handled that. Masked bulbs in boxes, slotted baffles, and sodium sim lamps that put out that sickly tram yellow from a distance without throwing heat. QF was the heat. Pans and trays took oil, coke, sometimes soaked sacking that could hold a glow and spread it in a predictable crawl. Controllers could starve or feed the burn with water valves, changing the shape of a street mid-raid. A QF field felt alive under a hose. Drown a tray and ember lines bent around the dark like water meeting a rock. SF, the Starfish, was where those tools scaled to a city profile. Dozens of QF clusters braided with QL runs, a grammar big enough that a bomber saw not a trick but a neighborhood. The signature had to scream, "Hit again." That meant density gradients a bomb aimer recognized from training photos, heavy burns near warehouses, softer, uneven pools across residential, and a clear brighter patch that implied power or plant. A staged power cut helped sell it. QL lanes blinked out in a stagger, then came back dirty, as if a substation limped. One detail from Shepperton earned a circle on Turner's board. Keep one wrong thing in sight. A steady, too-perfect line would betray the lie. A slight stutter in the tram told a brain it was human. All of it rode the wind. Every site had failsafes inked on the wall. If smoke stacked instead of sheeting, kill trays that fed the stack. If wind turned, protect the downwind black seams or the streets blur. If flares landed too close, shut the whole grammar, because a pathfinder overhead staring through a hood could learn more from a half-seen trick than from none at all. Emergency smothering kit sat in reach, sand, water, canvas, because the last sin was letting a decoy run hot past its cue and teach the wrong lesson at dawn. There was a lesson about layering. QL took point when fuel ran thin, a skeletal city of glow stitched to snaps of sound. QF came up only when the pathfinders' first candles fell, and only to the brightness the grammar demanded. Starfish arrays tied them together with a controller's breathing, up, down, hold, marching a blaze that never once burned wood, only oil and air, but convinced men in freezing cockpits they just opened a seam in the heart of a port. Here's where the lie left the field and met the sky. In parallel, Aspirin transmitters pressed deceptive dots into Nickerbean's lobe so centered felt off-center. Meacon beacons rebroadcast bearings so home shifted by a mile that felt like none. The Decoy didn't fight those signals, it embraced them. Sites were sighted where a bent fix would drop a line of bombs if the eyes agreed. They made the eyes agree. When a dial said, "This is right," the glow below said, "You did it again." On the damage map that never left a basement, pencil rings piled where marsh should have been quiet. In the control bunkers, men counted to 60 with smoke in their hair and waited for the next wave. First blood, Bristol's phantom blaze. Bristol was a bull's, a deep water port feeding a war economy, aero works that turned aluminium and sweat into engines, rail knots that pulsed coal and food. German planners kept circling it in red. If a heavy stick walked through the docks and then across the works, you wouldn't just lose a night, you'd lose a month. Turner's team picked a basin on Blackdown in the Mendips, out beyond the city lights, where a dockland could bloom under cloud and sell the story before bombs crossed the river. Controllers shadowed the pathfinders off the coast by wire and voice. Filter rooms called bearings. A regional controller in a concrete box near the site watched a wind vane twitch. The first markers fell on the real city, feeble pale candles in smoke, and he counted. 30 seconds, 40. He lifted one toggle. QL lanes blinked awake in a faint sodium smear that read like a tram grid broken by dark. A minute later, he opened the first QF trays. Ember crawled along a quay and bled into a basin that hadn't seen water in a century. The human edge lived in the field. Men in soaked sacking crouched by trays with paraffin-streaked hands, timing their sparks to a cue sheet pinned to memory. A wrong second could flatten the grammar. A gust hit, and one man shielded a flame with his body so the tray took on the first try. Another watched smoke go vertical and reached for a valve to starve a line before it stacked and blurred the street. Their faces shone orange for a breath, then went black again, heads down as if prayer could keep wind steady. Up above, the bomb stream bent. Crews felt the pull the doctrine had trained into them, hit the bright first, then walk left along the rail glow. The rail wasn't steel. It was a QL smear laid just beyond the brightest pool, steady as a ruler, selling that old habit. A stick hit scrub and peat with a thud that made men in the bunker flinch. No screams, no siren run, just that ticking shrapnel in wet ground that meant a gamble paid. Near Rington Warren, the damage map would later show a rash of craters where hedgerows should have been unbroken. In Bristol proper, you still got fire. This wasn't magic. But the centre kept air whole blocks that should have taken a second stick didn't. A hospital's night porter swore he'd felt the ground shiver and then go quiet, and the ward lights, dim and rationed, stayed steady enough to move the next trolley. On the docks, cranes that had been chalked as probable losses stood in the dawn light with fresh scuffs and new prayers. Controllers logged like accountants. Time on first marker, wind at tray height, delay to first QLQ, delay to first QF ember, ratio of bombs in decoy grid to bombs in city proper, pulled from the post-raid survey with boots still wet from marsh water. The ledger started to show a curve. If you lit within a tight window after Pathfinder markers, and your glow lanes sat just wrong relative to a bent beam, crews would drift toward the line. If you let QL sell the skeleton first, and only fed QF to match, your fuel went half as far and bought the same pull. There were mistakes. One Q ran hot for 10 seconds too long, and a Pathfinder wandering high searched it with a glide. The controller killed the lane, drowned a bright tray with a hiss that steamed the windscreen of the man who'd lit it. A second Q failed to spark, and a dark seam opened where a street should have stitched through. A runner sprinted with a flare to seed a quick white pop that read like a roof failing. It sold enough for the moment. It was marked for redesign by morning. But the pattern held. The first night didn't save a city alone. It saved a run, then a block, then a crane that loaded a ship that left on time. The next raid, the timing tightened. Controllers shaved 5 seconds off one Q, moved a QL rail smear by a yard, and watched the stick bend just a little earlier. Turner's team folded that into the tables, delay bands narrowed, spacing ratios refined. What looked like art from the field became numbers on a page, and those numbers told crews when to take the risk and when to drown a tray. In town, nobody got medals for fields that burned right. The men went home with smoke ground into their hair and pay envelopes stamped drainage. A woman who'd held a field phone to her ear for 3 hours, relaying wind calls and grid letters, bought bread on the way back to a bedsit and slept through her alarm. A dock fitter turned his cap in his hands and said he'd heard them go past, west and south, and stood until he couldn't hear them anymore. After action, the Bristol board in a basement that didn't have a name took 3 new pencil circles and drew them on a marsh. A second board, further up the chain, got a copy without place names, just times and hits, and the quiet math that said the fiction pulled a payload off the works. The lesson wasn't a speech. It was a new cue sheet, a reprinted code list, a shipment of coke that somehow moved under an agricultural stamp. First blood went to a city that didn't exist, and Bristol woke up with bruises instead of broken bones. Scaling the illusion from fields to a network. Proof meant pressure. If one Phantom Harbour could bend a bomb line, ministers wanted 10, then 20. Turner's phone didn't stop. Cities with docks, plants, tram grids all asked for a shadow twin. The problem wasn't just design, it was weight. Oil, coke, cable, bulbs, detonators, switchgear, every pound had to move under a ledger that never admitted what it was. And winter didn't care, nights stretched, raids stacked. If the fiction lagged, real brick paid. Standardization saved the pace. Turner's team broke a Starfish into kits, prefabricated trays with standard valves, cable looms cut to fixed lengths, junction boxes with spares in every crate, QL baffle sets labeled only by angle and throw. Control bunkers went modular, squat, 2-room cells poured in repeatable molds, with the same field phone jack point, the same wind vane mount, the same toggle layout in code. Crews could step into a new site and know exactly where Yard 3 lived without a single map on the wall. Mobile ignition crews formed. 2 trucks, 8 people, 1 foreman with a cue book and a wristwatch he'd checked against the filter room. They trained by torchlight in hedgerows, flipping dead toggles in rhythm, calling wind at tray height, learning to drown a lane without killing the whole grammar. Shepperton set men toured depots like travelling tutors, holding up baffles and asking, "Too clean, dirtier," drilling the mantra that carried through every county. Sell human imperfection. Make one lamp flicker wrong. Logistics wore a mask. Railway clerks logged coke as aggregate, oil as irrigation supply, cable as temporary pump line. Freight carriages routed to nameless sidings at night, unloaded by men listed as canal workers. Payment shells spread the cost across ministry pockets. No single column showed a city-scale fire that never burned a house. Requisitions asked for field drainage valves, and a week later, a crate of tray taps arrived with a stamped certificate no inspector would look at twice. Coverage grew like a net. Around ports, factories, airfields, and arterial rail yards, sites bloomed on high ground and in basins where glow would hang under cloud. By spring, a quiet lattice ringed the industrial spine of Britain. Ultimately, 237 decoy sites stitched into a parallel geography. Regional controllers learned the voices of their crews by the grain in a breath over a field phone. Filter rooms learned which basins would pick up a bent beam when Aspirin altered Knickerbean's low and Meacon shifted, ho, by an inch that felt like none. Feedback turned craft into doctrine. After-action teams with boots still wet from marsh water measured craters from hedgerow to hedgerow, timed scorch spreads on canvas test strips, and fed the numbers back into tables. Delay windows narrowed. QL first Q at 40 to 60 seconds after Pathfinder marker. QF Ember within 20 seconds of that if wind stayed under 12 knots at tray height. Spacing ratios adjusted so a rail smear would catch a second stick on habit alone. What looked like a painter's touch on night, one became a checklist any trained crew could run. Fuel strain forced choices. Tankers were finite, and every gallon spent on a field didn't power a lorry or a boat. The answer was discipline. QL took the front edge on marginal nights. Glow boxes, sodium sim lamps, rail flickers on rails literally laid in hedgerows, vehicle lights dragged on lines, and killed mid-swing to sell panic. QF came up only when markers fell, and only to the brightness a bomb aimer's eye expected. Controllers carried the knife. Starve trays by default, feed only where pattern demanded density. In practice, that meant saving heat for the moonless stretches and running mostly light when cloud thinned. Confidence rose with repetition. Crews who'd once lit with hands shaking now cut cues tight enough to shave fuel and still sell the lie. A foreman corrected a young hand without looking up. "Kill that tray 2 seconds sooner," and heard the click before the sentence ended. Controllers learned to hear a stream split by the unevenness in the drone and to time a power cut blink that would pull a second wave the same way the first had gone. Doctrine traveled in whispers and cue cards, not speeches. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe shifted. Altitudes climbed. Pathfinders scattered markers. Bomb toggles got mixed aiming points. The network absorbed it. Sights were paired, Starfish on the rim, QL close in, so if one Q missed the window, another picked up the slack. Crews rehearsed delayed ignitions and quick smothers to dodge German learning. A new trick, dummy mains, pops tied to AA chatter, rolled out on a Tuesday and ran in 3 counties by Friday, logged as field tests under an agricultural stamp. The scale didn't make the lie louder. It made it quieter and more exact. A map in a basement, no names, just grids, showed pencil rings gathering in marsh, heath and fallow field, while cranes, sheds and tram yards opened on schedule. Men and women who never met each other worked the same grammar in Dorset, on the Mendips, outside Portsmouth, along the Tyne. Their only common proof lived in mornings when the city they couldn't afford to lose still clocked on. The network wasn't a wall. It was a soft hand on a bomber's elbow, guiding it a mile wide, again and again, until winter broke. Light without fire, QL sights and the quiet lie. Fuel got tight. Tankers had other wars to feed, and the arithmetic turned cold. Every gallon burned in a tray wasn't moving bread, ore, or shells. Turner's answer wasn't bigger flames, it was quieter lies. QL, special lighting, would sell a city without heat. If QF was punctuation in fire, QL was the sentence you could read through haze. Sodium yellow, ankle high, slightly dirty, with stutters that felt human. Crews opened crates that didn't look like war. Masked bulbs sat behind slotted baffles. Glow boxes were lined with tin and soot to mute the throw. Lenses were tuned to mimic tram sodium and rationed street lamps. A QL lane ran like a whisper, just enough to survive fog and altitude, not enough to show a pathfinder's glass the trick. Shepperton's set men taught the touch. One bulb too clean and you'd betray the whole act. Put a flicker in the fourth. Let the seventh dim like a line hanging off a tired transformer. They laid tram lines, on rails hidden in hedgerows, a slow-moving twinkle that crossed a curve and then died mid-swing, because panic never completes a loop. Vehicle lights mounted on trolleys dragged along cableways blinked, paused, and jittered as if a lorry caught between orders and fear. You could run it all on a generator, swear was just for a pump. A QL city breathed in silence. At tray height, there was nothing to feel. Up high, through a hood, the glow said hit again, and the hands followed habit. QL worked because it respected training. Bomb aimers learned density, not drama. They looked for a gradient, brighter near works, softer across residential, and for signatures that confirmed they were on the right page. Tram yellows, power flickers, the faint spill off a rail seam. So QL sold those cues and let the brain fill in the heat. One controller joked, not unkindly, that he was setting lines for tired men to color in with bombs. Timing stayed tyrant. QL could go up earlier than QF without burning fuel, but if you lit too soon, you risked teaching. Doctrine settled into a dance. Pathfinders marked. QL snapped into a skeleton within a tight band. QF came up only where the grammar demanded weight. On thin nights, QL ran alone. Sodium tram flicker, a soft yard glow, a power cut blink that staggered down a lane, then limped back like a substation on its heels. You didn't need heat to trigger a trained reflex, just contrast and a good lie at the right angle. Pairings made the lie breathe. Starfish, the SF arrays, held QF muscle on the rim, while QL slipped closer to the city as faint bones. The two spoke to each other across miles. The controller in the rim bunker watched wind and raid flow and called a QL foreman by code. Open lane B, a faint rail smear came alive near River Bend. A minute later, the outer Starfish lifted an ember field, and the two together read as dock hit, rail still running, walk it. Crews overhead obliged. Detail sold everything. Shepperton's veterans argued about sodium color like zealots. They scraped bulbs with soot to kill a sterile edge. A baffle slot got widened by a finger's width to add a wobble in the fourth lamp down the line. They even staged blackout gaps, 2 lamps dead in a row, then one limping, to mimic a crew that lost a segment and fixed it badly. A tiny wink in the wrong place could give the whole field away. A tiny wrongness in the right place made it human. Recon's eyes weren't immune. Photos lied back. Daylight revealed nothing but posts and cables that looked like pump lines. Night frames, when they got them, caught the smear but not the trick. Worse for the Luftwaffe, return raids leaned on memory. Crews briefed off images where bright pools and rail lines matched a mental map that QL had bent by a mile. Misplotting rose, not because men forgot, but because the ghost city had been more convincing than the real one at the moment that mattered. Discipline was brutal. QL cycles synced to known German routes and beam schedules. Aspirin's jammers pressed dots into Nickerbean's lobe. Meacon pushed bearings just enough. QL sat where those nudges would steer eyes. If a beam came up late, QL waited. If cloud stacked wrong, QL killed lanes to avoid a smear that trained a pathfinder. Controllers treated light like ammunition. Finite, precious, never wasted on bravado. In the field, QL crews moved like stagehands who knew the lead might improvise. A foreman watched a cue card under blackout hood, fingers on switches labeled with lies. Open yard 3, a soft, dirty glow. Kill tram be halfway. The line stuttered, then died like a driver who saw something he couldn't name. They took pride in quiet. After a raid, a man would scrub his hands and say, "We never lit a tray." with the private satisfaction of someone who spent nothing and bought a result. On a thin winter week, that thrift meant coverage. Sites that couldn't have fed QF still ran a believable skeleton. A hospital on the edge of a city woke with windows rattled, not blown. A munitions line stitched through the shift as if the night hadn't tried to cut it. And across a lattice that stretched from the Tyne to the Mendips, the quiet lie kept working, not because it dazzled, but because it knew exactly how a trained eye reads the dark. The Thames game, protecting the arteries. While factories glowed inland, the real heartbeat ran along the river. The Thames fed London, docks unloading grain and ore, power lines stepping off switchyards, barges nosing through tide and fog. If the river broke, the city starved in slow motion. Turner's grammar had to work on water, where light slips, wind shifts, and smoke sits flat. And the lie had to live where a single miscue could send a stick into cranes you couldn't replace. They built false docklands in the river's shadow. QF pans sat low in flooded trays, so flame would lick over water and throw that greasy ripple of bomber reeds as key under haze. QL boxes hid in dummy warehouses, simple frames and tarps on piles that could glow just enough to draw a line along a wharf. A faint rail smear paralleled the basin because crews were taught to walk second sticks along the rail after a hit. Even the color mattered, not clean white, but the dirty sodium that says, lamps fighting smoke. Tide made the math mean. Light angles shift when the river drops. Reflections stretch at low water, tighten when the tide fills. Controllers pinned tide tables next to Q sheets. On a falling tide, QF trays came up earlier and died sooner, so the reflection kept its believable length. On a flood, they held QL longer and dimmed the yard to keep the glow from bleeding too far. Haze turned small mistakes into big tells, so crews worked with the river's breath. 2 feet wrong at the bank, and your dock read like a bonfire in a field. Human grit carried the hardware. Tug skippers ran blackout lines with cable and tray racks lashed low, easing past hulks and sandbars they could only feel with a pole. A man on a tug counted the bridge arches by sound, then slid into a shadow and waited for a hand signal from a bank crew he couldn't see. Under flak, a runner hauled a length of hose across, planks greasy with river mud to feed a starving tray. They didn't shout. They tapped metal twice and trusted the echo. Sound stitched the scene. A staggered series of small bangs traveled along the warehouse row, time to sell secondary fires working through doors and beams. A deeper thud from a concealed pan mimicked a quayside shed giving way. In a control box upriver, a man listened as if to weather. When AA chatter rose from a real battery to the north, he cued a QL flicker in the rail yard to make a seasoned aimer believe he'd bracketed transport. He knew he'd never meet the men hearing it through glass and cold air. The effect wasn't theory. On nights when beams pushed a stream down the estuary and Aspirin's dots pressed at the nerves, the first sticks often hit the real pools. But then drift took over, and the paired glow, the QF ripple, the QL lane, pulled a second run south into low ground and salt flat. Craters stitched across mud you could walk at noon. In the morning, cranes wore fresh scars but turned. Hoists creaked like old men getting up. Barges shrugged tarps and loaded as if nothing had tried to stop them. Iteration fed back into the grammar. Riverside QL patterns taught the team how urban glow breathes near water. Brighter just inland, softer at the lip, one lamp too far into the black to sell a watchman's mistake. Shepperton's veterans argued over the wet edge of light, then added a tiny wrongness to the dock line, a missing segment, a dimmed corner, to hint at a circuit on its last legs. Pathfinders teach themselves to distrust perfection. The river sites leaned into that. Discipline meant killing courage at the right second. A controller watched smoke begin to stack wrong and eddy off the flood tide, and killed a tray that still had fuel swallowing pride because the smear would read false from altitude. Another night, wind shifted over the bend, carrying ember where it would blur a street. An ignition crew drowned a field halfway through a perfect queue because the river had turned the lens against them. The best lies died clean rather than teach a lesson the enemy could brief on. Unknown to the men in cockpits, their instruments were being nudged into the story. Meacon beacons along the coast pulled bearings just enough that the home axis for a run bit south of truth. Aspirin pressed a dot tone into Nickerbean's lobe so centered, sounded like almost there. The decoy sat right where those errors converged with habit. The dial whispered yes. The glow said good hit. The toggles rose. The tugs rocked under the thud of bombs burying into mud. A night porter at a riverside hospital would later say the panes trembled and then stilled, and he could still read a chart by the rationed bulb in the corridor. A wharfman walked the planks at dawn, hands in his pockets, counting fresh craters in the flats and touching a crane leg as if to check it was real. He didn't know the names for QF or QL. He knew the line held and the river moved. The shadow map, counter-navigation by numbers. By winter's middle game, the lie wasn't just on the ground. It lived in bearings and seconds, a shadow map stitched from radio, habit, and the way tired men hear certainty in a tone. The threat was simple. If instruments overruled eyes, the glow might not matter. So Britain reached into the ether and tuned the needles to point at ghosts. The Germans called their early guide Nickerbean, crossed beams humming in Morse so a crew could ride the overlap to a target box. The RAF called the whole problem headache and their antidote aspirin, high-power transmitters that slipped an extra dot tone into the beam's lobes so centered sounded a breath off. Crews, hearing the familiar music, corrected toward a place the British chose. Meacon stations, the masking beacons, took ordinary Luftwaffe navigational signals, rebroadcast them from English ground, and bent bearings by a mile that felt like none. It wasn't brute jamming. It was persuasion. Let the dial whisper what you want at the moment, a hand reaches for a switch. Turner's people didn't run those boxes, but they read their drift like weather. Filter rooms logged when aspirin came up, and how Meacon shaded bearings along the coast. Regional controllers pinned that intelligence next to Q sheets. If a beam would carry a stream 10 miles east of truth, and Meacon leaned it south by a finger's width, a starfish sat where those wrongs met training. Decoys weren't random fields. They were placed where an aimer, convinced he was right, would want to see affirmation. Offsets became doctrine. Survey teams paced ground against the Luftwaffe's habits. Distance from coast legs, known turning points over estuaries, the way wind at altitude bled, dead reckoning 10 seconds late. They measured habitual error, how a crew tended to press left when a timing beep lagged by a breath, and cited QF trays and QL lanes on that left. A rail glow didn't just lie parallel to a key. It lay where a man who'd been taught to walk a second stick would reach if his lobe said almost. Under cloud, almost is a compass. Data hardened the art. Post-raid, surveyors trudged through hedgerows with rulers and notebooks, counting craters into grids whose place names never left the page. They marked entry vectors, first hit points, and the angle the stick walked. Those angles fed timing tables. If pathfinders marked at T, QL skeleton at T plus 45 to T plus 60 seconds. If wind at tray height stood under 12 knots from northwest, QF ember at T plus 65 to T plus 80 on a gradient that matched last week's density curve. Spacing ratios tuned rail smear offsets so the second stick bent where the last one had. A war is 1,000 guesses turned into 10 rules. The shadow map wrote them down. Meanwhile, the beams evolved. X-Gerat, Y-Gerat, new names and better clocks. The principle held. Britain listened, measured, and slipped a fingernail into the hinge. Aspirin layered dots into the lobe so certainty fuzzed at the edge. Meacon relayed bearings from new ground so plots drifted toward emptiness. Decoys were recited by pencil and spade to keep the convergence alive. Sometimes the field moved 100 yards. Sometimes the Q window narrowed by 5 seconds. The men in the bunkers didn't need the reason. Their toggles met the new table, and the glow spoke where the dial would want it. Convergence was the point. A lie alone fails. Two lies that agree become a truth someone can act on. The eye saw a tremolo line jitter and die mid-swing. The ear heard a dot tone say almost, the hand released. When crews debriefed, they told coherent stories. We crossed the coast on the beam. Markers were in, docks burning, rails still running. We walked it. Their maps came back with grease pencil arrows that matched hedgerow craters miles from a crane. Proof didn't live in a boast. It lived in the pattern that reappeared when no one thought they'd been fooled. The human layer glued it all. Controllers learned to hear the beam fight in the way as streams drone thickened, an unevenness that meant some crews were chasing dots and others were flying memory. They'd hold QL a breath longer if the tone seemed late, or kill a power cut blink if pathfinders were sweeping high. AA batteries, reading the same plot, stitched tracer where it would make the yard feel bracketed. A pathfinder that doubted the glow found inputs that agreed. Light, sound, needles. Doubt died. There were nights the ether ran hot and the ground couldn't keep up. A Meacon went quiet for 10 minutes. A jamming schedule slipped. A beam came up late. The ledger documented those misses. Decoy pulls weakened. Sticks walked truer. Damage rings bit closer to cranes and sheds. Turner's tables didn't hide it. They penciled a caveat. Weather, crew skill, beam strength, variables you can't own. The answer wasn't denial. It was iteration. Shift a sight. Tighten a window. Add a wrongness in a lamp that the rails kink. Make the next almost more convincing. Across counties, a parallel Britain kept breathing. On unnamed boards, pencil circles clustered in marsh, heath and fallow while factories spun, cranes lifted, hospitals lit dim bulbs and kept charts legible. The shadow map didn't win nights with a shout. It won them with 1,000 quiet agreements. A beam hummed, a lamp flickered, a tray licked, a man believed, and another city woke up. The quiet math of survival. When the smoke thinned, the ledger came out. It wasn't enough to feel a good night. Turner's circle had to prove it. Fuel was rationed. Men were tired. Secrecy burned calories nobody could spare. Luck couldn't carry a budget line. So they built a private arithmetic that translated glows and thuds into a case for survival. Survey teams walked grids before breakfast. Crater counts went into boxes with no place names. Decoy field, city proper, rail yard edge. Entry bearings, stick angles, first and last impacts all penciled tight. Controllers added times, T for pathfinder markers, T plus for QL and QFQs, wind at tray height, beam reports from filter rooms. The first pattern hardened. Where the grammar met the ether's nudge, payloads wandered wide. Not guesswork, ratios. On defined nights near Bristol and Portsmouth, more bombs fell in Starfish rectangles than within the factory perimeters they were meant to break. Case files stacked. A December run that should have walked the docks instead stitched across marsh. Cranes clocked on. A January raid pushed up the estuary, but second sticks bent to a QL rail smear laid a mile south. The power station breathed thin and steady through dawn. In the Midlands, a residential grid took bruises on fallow ground, while a machine shop opened with windows rattled and benches intact. Each file paired a field's quiet with an output that should have failed. Coal unloaded on time, a convoy assembled, a hospital's theatre lit by a rationed bulb that didn't go out. The numbers got colder. Controllers tallied deke hit percentages against real target strikes by date window and moon phase. They matched those to production ticks. Shifts kept, tonnage moved, days lost averted. The human return sat between the lines. A family who'd listened to engines all night unlocked a door to a street that should have burned and found only plaster dust on the sill. A fitter touched a crane leg like a priest checking a relic and went to work. They never saw the marsh crater map. They lived its argument. Turner's ledger carried a headline no newspaper printed. Lives saved, estimated. Fold in the nights when bombs walked mud and not brick. Subtract the ones where beams ran hot and the grammar didn't pull. Account for weather that killed a Q or a Meacon that went quiet. The figure the circle wrote in pencil and refused to round up was simple and human, on the order of 2,500 civilians who didn't die in flames or under falling timber because eyes and dials agreed to strike ghosts. The committee didn't carve it in stone. They kept it in a drawer and worked the next table. Confidence didn't mean complacency. Variability stayed in the margins. Where the humbles lies, wind at tray height above 12 knots twisted smoke into smears. Haze at River Bend made reflections red wrong. Low cloud turned good rail glow into a blur. Crew skill cut both ways. A pathfinder who distrusted perfection could ruin a night by refusing a cue. A tired aimer might follow habit into a field as neat as a classroom exercise. Beam strength mattered. When X or Y-Gerat ran tight, Aspirin and Meacon had to keep the convergence alive, or the groundwork went deaf. So the math-fed doctrine: if wind swung late, drown trays and let QL carry. If beams hummed hard, slide QL lanes by a yard and shave 5 seconds off the power cut, blink to catch the reflex you knew would fire. If an after-action photo hinted a pathfinder had stared too long at a particular flicker, kill that flicker in the next Q sheet and replace it with a different wrongness a county over. Never teach the same lesson twice within reach of a camera. AA Command noticed in its own way. Battery officers who logged, ineffective, nights still filed reports where tracers stitched above yards that didn't exist. Those threads wove into Turner's sums. If tracer and glow stitched the same lie, pulls got stronger. Filter rooms learned to smell when a stream believed. An uneven drone, a correction that came a beat early and tipped controllers to hold a QL lane a breath longer. Human senses became inputs. The math learned to counter tone in a voice. And in kitchens and shelters, the return was measured in routines kept. Kids walked to school past taped windows. Trams ran with cracked glass and drivers who'd slept 2 hours. A woman who'd folded bandages through the night hung them to dry and bought bread. They weren't spared war. They were spared collapse. The quiet math bought that margin, not glory, not parades. Just enough life left in the morning to fight the next night on terms Britain could afford. When the enemy learns, German adjustments. The lie worked long enough to earn an answer. Luftwaffe crews weren't fools. Debriefs in occupied airfields filled with the same itch. Too many docks that didn't tally with damage photos. Too many sticks that felt right and proved wrong. So they climbed. Higher altitudes pushed above some haze tricks and stretched the angle on reflections. Pathfinders changed cadence. More scattered markers, mixed aiming points, brief corrections to shake pursuers. The neat rails of habit got crooked on purpose. Britain listened to the change and shaved the grammar. Controllers held ignitions longer, then lit later. Delayed cues that still caught the second wave after the first drifted on confusion. QF and QL pairings were resequenced. Instead of Ember first and Rail next, some nights the faint QL skeleton breathed early and the heat punched in tight, then died, then returned off-beat to upset a pathfinder's timing. Dummy mains, pops, low thuds spaced like gas lines failing, synced with real AA chatter to paint a bracket a veteran would trust. Higher altitude meant broader smear, so Starfish arrays spread signatures without turning theatrical. Bright pools thinned by degrees, black seams, the streets went fractionally wider to survive a taller view. Shepperton set men rewrote Q sheets around altitude. Slower flickers with longer fades sold distance to a bomb aimer's eye. Controllers wrote a new note on the wall. At 15,000 feet, perfection kills, give them breath. Germany also tried mixed aiming, 2 briefed points in a single run so decoys couldn't catch both. Britain answered with bait, selective blackout reversals, 1 planned leak in a real district, 2 carefully killed in another, forced recalibration errors mid-flight. A crew that shifted aim on the fly found the livelier patch sat exactly where a Meacon bent bearing wanted it. Aspirin pressed dots into Nickerbean's lobe on the new schedule. Decoy sighting nudged where those dots would coax the last correction. The dial and the glow shook hands again. Fuel strain never left, so trade-offs tightened. You couldn't flood a field every time the Luftwaffe tried something clever. Controllers conserved QF like munitions, leaning harder on QL to paint the bone structure of a city, tram flickers, rail smears, dirty yard pools, then bringing heat only as punctuation where density had to scream, hit this twice. A young foreman learned to love the kill switch more than the spark. He'd drown a pretty tray, without a second thought, if the wind or altitude turned the grammar brittle. Outcome wasn't a straight line to safety. It was a held margin. Losses still came. Pathfinders who distrusted anything too tidy stayed dangerous. On some nights, the ether ran thin, jammers off schedule, Meacons masked by weather, and the lie couldn't reach up to meet the needles. But the network's scale held the effect. With 237 decoy sites alive on cue cards and toggles, a single clever raid couldn't teach the whole island a lesson. 1 county bled, 2 counties over, a phantom yard drank the next stick. Doctrine adapted in a whisper. Regional controllers briefed, late light drills, ignitions held until pathfinders committed to mixed markers, then snapped on hard for 90 seconds, then dead. Across town, a QL crew ran a skip tram, a jitter that blinked like a line crossing a bomb cut, then stopping, then limping, a human mistake baked into a wire. AA batteries, hearing the same plot, fired tracer in short, ragged bursts over Decoy yards, not to hit, but to sell bracket. The choreography stayed human, imperfection rehearsed. There were baits that strung. A selective blackout reversal drew a stick 2 near a real ward, and a controller who'd ordered it sat with the ledger and wrote the cost next to the lesson. The next week, the same trick ran a mile further out, paired with a dummy, mains, thud and a shorter QL pulse. It pulled cleaner. Nothing about the learning was free. What nobody wrote down in the cue books was the rhythm that crept into hands. A controller could hear a Pathfinder's new scatter in the spread of drone, feel a high-altitude run in the way sound arrived, softer, slower, and time a delayed ember that still sold, residential from too far up. A foreman could watch smoke shear in a higher wind and widen a black seen with a valve twist by instinct. The grammar bent, the readers changed, the lie spoke new dialect. And when the Luftwaffe rotated crews and lectured caution, Britain answered with quiet confidence. Not bigger flames, not bolder leaks, just steadier hands on toggles, new wrongnesses where old ones got spotted. QF and QL waltzed out of step so no camera could brief certainty. Enough held to keep mornings functional, cranes ticking, wards open, bread on counters. The enemy learned, and so did the fires. The map stayed a step wrong. The people of fire, handlers, controllers, and cover. They never wore uniforms that said what they did. On paper, they were farm hands, canal men, night watch. In truth, they were ignition crews, runners, and controllers who spoke Turner's grammar with burned knuckles and hoarse voices. Training started under blackout. Shepperton's set men stood in muddy yards holding lamps and baffles like props. Kill perfection, they'd say. Make one lamp wrong. Crews learned cue timing with pocket watches and whispered counts. QL first flicker, pause, QF ember on the breath after the Pathfinder's second candle. Wind calls weren't theory. A man climbed a low frame with a rag on a stick, watched the smoke lean, and shouted a number the controller wrote in grease pencil. Tray height, 12 knots from west-northwest. An ignition hand wrapped his sleeves in soaked sacking, knelt by a star tray, and felt for the moment the oil wanted flame. He'd shield a match from wind with his whole body, then pull away fast so his cuffs didn't catch. If smoke stacked wrong, he drowned a pan with a twist and took the hiss in his face. You learn to love the kill more than the spark, because a drowned tray could save a whole street of the lie. Controllers lived inside concrete boxes sunk into slopes, headphones biting their ears, field phones hot. Filter rooms fed raiding tracks in clipped voices. A vane rattled above the roof. Their toggles were labeled with lies, open yard, closed tram, and their job was to keep a human rhythm inside the math. A good controller could hear a stream split in the unevenness of the drone and hold a QL lane just long enough to catch the second wave. Micro-stories never made the ledgers, but they told the truth. A hospital on the city edge owed a night to a woman with a pencil behind her ear and a cue card under a hood. She heard the first markers land soft, counted through her fear, and said, "Now," into a handset. A field half a mile away woke with sodium flicker. The second stick that should have crossed her roof walked mud. She folded the card and went back to the switchboard like she'd only routed a call. Another night, a missed signal cost a tray. A young hand fumbled a flare. The ember line stuttered and opened a hole where a street should have been. The controller killed the lane rather than teach the wrong lesson. After the raid, the foreman took the blame, then sat with the kid under a hedgerow, and they lit and drowned an empty pan until the timing was in his wrists. Cover lives ran parallel. Men came into town smelling of river mud and oil and said they drained a ditch. Women with black under their nails paid for tea with pay packets stamped drainage. They kept their mouths shut in pubs because words traveled and the thing they were building only worked if it stayed mostly invisible. At home, their hands shook when they buttoned a child's coat. They slept through alarms and woke at dusk feeling guilty for not leaving a note. Quiet trauma threaded the days. Burns healed into slick patches that ached when weather turned. Ears rang for weeks. Nightmares arrived on schedule. The hiss of a drowned tray, the flat thud of a stick hitting peat, the one cue lit half a second too long. Nobody pinned medals on coats that didn't exist. They carried it like wet wool. Records hid the heartbeat. Foremen kept notebooks in pencil, wind calls, cue times, which lamp flickered false and which sold well. Coded ledgers tallied hours as field maintenance, while margins held the real tempo. Second wave believed, hold tram be longer. A controller wrote, hospital safe, in a hand that tried to be indifferent. Perils scattered across ministries masked the surge nights. You could read ops tempo as dips in agricultural fuel and bumps in canal. Wages, if you knew which columns to add. They drilled shutdowns like a creed. If the wind turns, drown it. If the pathfinder looks, black it out. Never teach. In blackout fields, they practiced killing a beautiful cue mid-bloom, letting pride die for discipline. Shepperton's set men came back with new wrongnesses to learn. Lamp 4 flicker, rail smear dim at the kink, and crews folded them into muscle. They had no parades. Their proof lived in mornings. A tram squealed past cracked glass. A crane groaned and lifted. A ward light glowed dim and steady over a nurse's hands. The people of fire walked to work with smoke in their hair and said nothing about the map. They'd kept one step wrong. After the flames, secrecy, memory, and erasure. When the sirens fell quiet, the fires didn't get a victory lap. They got dug up. Trays were hauled out of basins and stacked as scrap. Bunkers were filled with spoil and seeded with grass. Cables were cut into lengths that looked like old pump lines and tossed in hedgerows. The ledger pages that had kept cue times and wind calls went into envelopes with red tags and vanished into drawers nobody could name out loud. Fields were replanted. Marsh took back its silence. The map folded over the lie and made it countryside again. Secrecy locked down what memory wanted to claim. The men and women whose hands smelled like oil and sodium lived under those cover names a while longer and then returned to jobs that had proof you could touch. Fences mended, gates hung, ditches cleared. In town, a foreman would nod at a field and say, "Burned right, that one," and bite his tongue. If you asked what that meant, you got a shrug and a story about poachers. The truth was kept as process notes, not poetry, and those notes stayed buried. Declassification didn't arrive like a flood. It trickled. A local farmer on the Mendips swore his hedgerow had shrapnel in a straight line, and no one believed him till a map came out of a box decades later with a ring around Rington Warren. People in Bristol talked about nights when the sky burned south of town or the docks woke up intact. Someone pointed to a patch on black down and said, "Here," and a historian put a pin in a board. Stories that had sounded like old men flattering themselves turned out to be footnotes in a file stamped home security. The echoes carried forward in odd shapes. The Cold War loved a decoy. Dummy airfields, fake runways lit just enough to pull eyes, radar reflectors that drew a beam's attention, heat pans that sold a photo at altitude. The pairing that Turner's Circle had worked in the Blitz, physical cues that fooled trained eyes, and electronic nudges that tuned needles toward ghosts became a template. Aspirin and Meacon sat in manuals as case studies in how not to jam, how to deceive. Later operators learned to layer. One lie in the ether, one on the ground, both believable, both timed to a human reflex. Turner's quiet lesson survived as DNA, method beating hardware. He hadn't built a gadget that won a war. He built a process that made 1,000 small wrongnesses agree. The Shepperton grammar, kill perfection, add a human stutter, cell density where habit expects it, outlived the trays and bulbs. In modern hands, that grammar shifted medium. A heat pan became a spoofed AIS track. A sodium flicker became a faint radar return with jitter added like a lamp's stutter. A power cut blink turned into a network burp staged in a telemetry feed. The trick wasn't technology. It was timing, placement, and the nerve to drown a beautiful cue if it started to teach. Here, the warning folded into the history. Once you weaponize metadata, the cues people trust because they can't afford not to, reality starts to wobble on contact. In the Blitz, it was bearings, gradients, and the cadence of a tone. Today, it's tags, pings, and signal hygiene. Crews then weren't stupid. Neither are operators now. But people reach for patterns under stress. And a system that tunes those patterns a degree wrong can move a bomb load, a convoy, or a market while the truth stands a mile aside, waiting for dawn. D-class files show where the line frayed. There were nights a camera caught a flicker that looped too clean. A lesson traveled the wrong way for a week until cue sheets were rewritten. Memory itself is like that camera. It loves neat arcs. The real story looks like pencil notes in a margin. Hold tram be longer. No, too clean. Shift rail smear by 1 yard. The glamour lives in the blaze. The power lives in the edits most people never see, and the self-discipline to erase your own signature when it starts to shine. Back on those hills, a broken concrete lip peeks out of grass where a bunker roof sagged. A dog walker pauses, wonders what the slab was for, and moves on. A man who once kept toggles in his hands sits in a chair by a window and says nothing. The cranes he saved were melted for peacetime steel. The cue cards turned to brown paper, but the grammar he learned moved on. It travels now as ghost signatures, fleets that exist on screens, radars that see decoys, maps that speak in stutters trained eyes have been taught to obey. What survives isn't flame, it's a habit. Measure, misalign, and meet your lie where a trained person wants to believe something. Do it quietly. Do it with mercy for the mornings you're trying to buy. Britain didn't just fight bombers. It rewired the map bombers trusted. 237 decoy sites turning light and heat into shields, and roughly 2,500 people lived because the lie held. Rig the metadata and the enemy sees what you want until they don't. Pair physical cues, QF, QL, SF, with electronic misdirection, Aspirin and Meacon, and you can move force without force. If you want the hidden playbook behind today's ghost fleets and phantom radars, subscribe and watch our next deep dive. New episodes weekly. Follow the patterns others miss before they guide you somewhere you can't afford to go.